Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Thomas. I'm the director of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. I want to welcome you to our ongoing multi-part series entitled Falling and Rising, Public Monuments and Cultural Heritage in a Time of Protest. Through a series of interviews with art historians, and artists and archaeologists that work across cultures and disciplines, we hope to examine the current cultural moment of renewed attention to the role of public art. With a particular interest and focus on material culture and art history, our hope is that these conversations will add to the ongoing discussions happening more broadly in communities around the world. Today, we travel back to look at the public art and architecture in ancient Rome. I feel particularly excited to conduct today's interview, first and foremost, because our interviewee is a longtime friend and colleague. Penelope Davies is a professor in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Texas at Austin. Specializing in architectural history of ancient Rome, she is author of Death and the Emperor, first published by Cambridge University Press in 2000, and Architecture and Politics in Republican Rome, also published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. She's also written numerous articles and essays in scholarly publications and journals, and has collaborated on reconceptions of the Jansen series of art history textbooks. Her current book projects are Ancient Lives of Roman Buildings and Architecture and Regime Change in Ancient Rome, as well as the co-edited Cambridge Urban History of Europe. Penelope, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about Roman architecture.
Well, I thought it would be sort of, I kind of envision this as being sort of one of the chats that we might have.
One of our many chats.
Or have had, so many of these, so this is great. Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump right in. Tell us about this new book project, The Ancient Lives of Roman Buildings.
I'd love to. I'm a little uncertain about the title. I'm not really sure that I've got it yet, but it's sort of that, Ancient Lives of Roman Buildings. And what it's inspired by is really two observations. One of those is that when we are looking at Roman buildings, trying to understand them for their meaning in antiquity, we tend almost exclusively to focus on the moment of the dedication, the moment of the inauguration, something like the ribbon cutting, if they had a ribbon cutting in antiquity. And we don't look at the other moments. And so that's one of the observations. And the other is that when we do look at the broader lives of Roman buildings, we tend to look at post-antique times. So for instance, we're looking at buildings being repurposed as churches, think the Pantheon, or mosques, think the Roman fortress for the Great Mosque at Damascus. So what I'm trying to do in this project is to look at afterlives, before lives too, if you like, but lives in general, diverse moments in the life of a Roman building, but diverse moments in the Roman life of a Roman building. And what it starts with is basic conception of a building, construction of a building, goes on to weathering, other forms of damage, recasting, repurposing, reconstruction, and then the downward slope, vandalism, demolition, and then finally Roman thoughts about ruins, which are quite different from ours in many ways. And basically what I'm trying to do is to understand what architecture meant to Romans at any of those moments. And as you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that most of the time I'm interested in the political significance of these buildings at those moments. I mean, I could give you a couple of examples of how this might work. So if you think about the construction process, any of us who've lived close to construction happening, and my students, for instance, who are on Zoom and have to close off everything that's going on around them because of construction happening next door or whatever, we're all familiar with the noise, the dust, the road closures, all of these things that make building problematic to live around. And Romans were no different in that respect. You have to imagine transportation of materials by huge teams of oxen. You have to imagine the dirt, the noise of stonemasons chipping marble, etc., etc., etc. And the dirt underfoot, the mud underfoot, the water, etc., etc., etc. And at certain moments, you have to imagine that this is just how it goes. This is just the unavoidable corollary of a world that has a lot of public building. But for this project, I started to notice an interesting coincidence between the moments during the failure of the Roman Republic, so the 1st century BCE, the moments when you had spikes in political unrest, and the times immediately thereafter, and spikes in public construction in particular places. And what you'll notice is that in those, I think what's going on is that people like Sulla and his partisans in the 80s and 70s, and Augustus during the last decades of the 1st century BCE, are actually trying to use construction deliberately in and around the places where public protest would happen to shut public protest down. So it's a form of repression, a form of a way to stop any kind of sedition. And that.
Wait, I want to stop you there. So it's sort of filling a void. I mean, if this is a place where things can happen, then let's put a building there, and it'll to, in essence, control crowds.
Well, more than that, the building is the excuse, in a sense. If the Forum is a place where everybody gathers to protest, and this is where they've had riots, where they've had lynchings, they've had serious problems in the Forum. So the best thing you can think of to do is basically make the Forum unusable. So make it a building site. And then people are going to just go elsewhere. At the end of the day, it may just prove too bothersome to meet there if it was somewhere you were going to meet friends or whatever. Various different kinds of business are going to have to move elsewhere, but essentially you decentralize. You make it impossible for that space to be used for normal business, yes, but also for the purposes of protest.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So I have another question. So if we think that ancient, obviously you're talking about the ancient lives of buildings, right. And I know that architecture is your area of primary area of concern. But what about other monuments such as public sculpture? Did those have lives as well?
Short answer, yes. I think we need to back up a little bit and start by recognizing that for Romans, well, Romans culturally are predisposed to the idea that things had lives. This is quite different from us. Romans are a pre-industrial society, and they're not like us in our sort of consumer mentality in the present day capitalist West, where if something doesn't work anymore, you just throw it away and get another one. Romans don't like throwing things away in general. They like to reuse things. So we hear about papyrus recycling. We hear about loads of auctions and secondhand markets for all kinds of things, fine quality things, lesser quality things, sculpture, furniture, tableware, etc. I mean, you know as better than anybody that they maintained and restored murals. They maintained and restored mosaics, even in really luxury homes where they could obviously afford to replace them if they wanted to, but they didn't. They restored them. They constantly repainted, regilded artworks. And if an inscription was somewhat out of date, they would just rework it to make it clearer, to include new titles or whatever. And it's also true that they adapted things. So it's not just the upkeep, it's adaptation as well, mainly sculpture for all kinds of reasons. And these reasons might range from the economic to trying to honor or dishonor, often dishonor, the subject of a portrait. This was not problematic to a Roman. You think of Julius Caesar in his new forum, the Forum Iulium. He puts a sculpture in the center of it, an equestrian sculpture of Alexander the Great, by no less an artist than Lysippus, the great artist who was responsible for Alexander the Great's portraiture, and he takes the head off, substitutes it with a head of himself. And you can imagine the Romans having all kinds of reactions to this. But the reaction they're not going to have is, this is a damage to the work of art. That's not what worries them. They're used to this kind of recycling. And there's in fact a very nice recent book on reuse and innovation in material culture by Diane Ing and Molly Swetton-Burland. And they actually question whether Romans ever thought of a work of art or a work of architecture as being finished in the way that we do, and more that there was this constant enriching of the cityscape and the urban environment. And so that's, I think we have to make a sort of mental shift when thinking about lives of ancient things in general, and certainly artworks.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. And so I guess the next question for me is, and you've touched on this already, but the idea of deaths. I mean, if these things have lives, then obviously, as you've talked about, the Roman sort of opinion toward ruins, and obviously some of these ancient Roman buildings that made their way and were into the medieval period and were in early Christian periods and changed to churches and whatnot. But talk a bit about, at least at the moment in ancient Rome, of the death of these buildings and monuments.
Okay, so as you know, we have a lot of evidence for damnatio memoriae. This is a modern term that we use to describe condemnation of memory for unpopular emperors such as Nero, Domitian, and members of their court, not just the emperor. And at those moments, you see statues being toppled, you see portraits being removed from relief sculpture, you see names gouged out of inscriptions and coins and so on. Sometimes spontaneously, sometimes by order of the Senate. So that's sculpture and so on, other works of art. But when it comes to architecture, it's, in a way, it's a little bit more complicated. They did demolish. They demolished for a number of reasons. They demolished sometimes to provide land for reuse for a different purpose. We don't have evidence of a kind of wholesale destruction that we find with, say, Haussmann in Paris. But we do know of deliberate destructions for, obviously for reconstruction, right? So that when Sulla is going to enlarge the Senate house, he's got to demolish it first in order to reconstruct it. That much is clear. But we also hear about buildings such as houses being demolished to make way for a forum or for a basilica. We hear of temples as well, the Temple of Pietas, which Julius Caesar demolishes in order to make way for a theatre, which will be eventually the theatre of Marcellus. And he was actually condemned by the senatorial elite for this, presumably because it showed a lack of piety or something. These things we might characterize as practical. I'm not sure they're entirely practical, because in a sense, who chooses what the city looks like, who chooses what gets demolished, is actually choosing who a culture is, who a society is. So there is an ideological quality to that as well. But then there's a whole series of demolitions that are much more obviously ideological. For instance, for the removal of an institution, as at Santo Mabono, the site named for the church now located there. But there was a temple there from the regal period, way back, 6th century BCE. And at the point where the last of the kings was expelled and a republic set up in place, coincident with that, this temple that was associated with kingship was demolished and its terracottas ritually buried. And scholars think that perhaps that was a way of removing an institution that Romans were not happy with. In the Republic, we do find demolitions used or characterized as being used in the literary tradition. Some of these are not really historical events, but the idea is that a house is demolished to get rid of an individual precisely who had been aspiring to kingship, kingship being something that Romans would not tolerate. And we hear cases of, say, Spurius Cassius, whose house is replaced by the Temple of Tellus when he dies in 485 BCE, and other cases like that. We know a couple of these cases were definitely historical. The case, for instance, of Fulvius Flaccus, who was a cohort of Gracchus, of Gaius Gracchus in 121. His house on the Palatine was demolished, and Cicero's house was demolished too. So we know that they did this as a way of removing something that symbolized the person, but also symbolized where that person gathered their network, and a network of people who had engaged in what was essentially treason against the state. We don't find so much of this in the empire. We have a case of it happening with Augustus, where he inherits a very expensive house from somebody, Vettius Pollio, and Vettius Pollio says, could you make this nice monument to my memory? And instead, Augustus has it razed to the ground. But then this practice of getting rid of houses sort of dies off, really. Some would say that the Domus Aurea, the great Golden House Palace of Nero, was demolished as part of his condemnation of memory. I don't believe there's the evidence to support that, though that's contentious, obviously.
Let me jump in real quick.
Yeah.
Do you buy the idea, though, that the repurposing of much of the lands, for example, for the Flavian amphitheater, were clearly moves to sort of give to the people?
Oh, I think this could take us all day.
Yeah, well,
I think there are some really interesting things going on. I'm not sure how easy it would be for me to encapsulate this in just a few sentences. Yes, it is a way of giving back. It is a way of entertaining the people in the same way as Nero had entertained the people. He famously looked after the people. It's a way for the emperor to be close to the people. Nero was famous for being accessible to the people. But what the senatorial elite hated about Nero, and they're the ones who really create this tradition of how awful Nero was, what they hated was the fact that he was subverting Roman society, creating a sort of perpetual saturnalia, and an amphitheater puts people back into social rank. Everybody is seated according to rank. So there's a visible reordering of society that goes on there. They hated about him the fact that he was interested in Greek things, and this was a very Roman type of monument. So rather than a giving back, I see it as an act of rather fantastic diplomacy between two groups of people.
I think that's a great answer, and I love it. And expertly done in a few sentences.
Yeah,
so I would ask you then, so we're talking about sort of people who are making conscious choices to perhaps raise a building or a house. But let's get back to putting things up. From the point of those who commissioned them, can you talk about, what is the role of public monuments in ancient Rome? I know that's a broad question, but the nitty gritty of it, what are they doing?
Well, it is a broad question. It's a huge question, a very messy question. There's so much that they're doing.
Yeah.
I think, again, we have to back up and recognize that we are a very literary and a very literate culture. Estimates that I found in a very modest search online told me that in the US in 2018, the literacy rate was 99%. That's incredible. It's very hard for us then to think back to a time when the literacy rate was, maximum estimates that I've found 30% in Hellenistic cities, but usually much lower than that. And back to a time before people were writing histories, which is the time when Roman buildings were first conceived, when they first started to take on meaning. If we think that Romans only started writing histories at the end of the 3rd century BCE, Long before that, they were putting up monuments. They were principally putting up temples. Some of those had narrative paintings in them of one sort or another. Not so many, but some of them did. They were also putting up aqueducts. They were putting up honorific columns, all kinds of different monuments. These monuments, before the writing of history, these monuments were the principal purveyors of history. They recorded wars, they recorded class struggles, they recorded famines, all kinds of things. That's how information was given to the people. And built into their function when they were first conceived was the whole notion of being these historical markers. I mean, that's part of the word, that's the etymology of the word, monumentum, from monere, to remind. Then even after the birth of history, birth of history writing, they're still one of the most widely available and legible of the means of communication available to people. If you control history, if you control communication, you obviously have power. In much of the Mediterranean, that kind of power went to kings. That's not the case in Republican Rome. In Republican Rome, broadly speaking, it's the senatorial class who have this kind of power. More specifically, it's a small group of elected magistrates. These are magistrates are political officials. They're not people involved with the law in any more specific sense. They're in office for a year. They always have at least one colleague. And to pay for these monuments, they use state resources. So they use these monuments, even with those constraints, a year and state resources, they use these monuments to climb the political ladder. So if you're one of these low magistrates, you put up buildings that will help you move up to, say, a consul, and then eventually to a censor if you're very lucky. And in turn, what these offices meant to them was immeasurable social prestige, financial profit, and making a name for their family and for posterity. And if you make a name for yourself, your sons are more likely to get into politics. And if your sons continue in politics, your memory is likely to stay alive longer. So there's quite a lot involved for them. Then you fast forward to the end of the Republic, and the collaborative spirit, where you always have a colleague in office with you, this collaborative spirit starts to break down. And so do the constraints on sponsorship. So you end up with individuals, Pompey, then Caesar, achieving unparalleled authority without colleagues. They use that primacy to pretty much monopolize public building, creating vast projects in the city. And those vast projects in turn gave them sufficient authority to prolong their primacy without a colleague. So it's a lovely sort of circle that feeds itself. That system essentially lasted into the empire. You have, by the end of the 1st century, pretty much just the imperial family that is putting up these monuments. Outside the imperial family, nobody triumphs after 19 BCE, and that means that nobody can use money that they've gained from spoils to put up monuments. So that's a nice way of controlling things. And so the emperors who in the city of Rome, it's different outside of Rome, but who in the city of Rome pretty much have a monopoly on ancient building, they spend most of their energies on buildings that are for popular benefaction. So amphitheaters, circuses, basically bread and circuses to keep people happy, because this is a means of legitimizing and sustaining their autocratic power, which is fairly important given that they're constantly struggling with this paradox that they are absolute rulers in a society in which they're actually not allowed to describe themselves as that or really fully act as that. So they're constantly trying to negotiate their primacy in a situation that doesn't really allow them primacy at all. There is one exception, which is that there are monuments, honorific monuments, that keep being put up by the Senate. And I think we tend to minimize this a little bit, but these monuments are basically arches and altars. And I think we have to recognize that what the Senate is doing with these is trying to negotiate its own position vis-a-vis the emperor, trying not to lose its relevance in government.
Well, and so, all right, I'm going to push you a little bit out of your wheelhouse, as it were. As someone who spends, and you clearly do this, a lot of time thinking about politics of Roman public monuments and buildings, do you see any similar strategies in the way that we use them today, or the way that modern societies have utilized such monuments?
I think there are some similarities and some differences. When we talk about monuments in ancient Rome, we tend to be talking about all public buildings, I think. So arches and columns and so on, as well as the Senate House and so on and so forth. And that's not just because they serve now as reminders of an ancient past, but because the ancients really thought of them that way as well. And so it's a much bigger group of buildings than it is today. Today, when we talk about monuments, we tend to be thinking of an artwork or something that is a building like an arch or something, but we wouldn't necessarily talk about the city hall as a monument in the same way as we do for antiquity. And I think that tends to narrow the way we think about the whole concept of a monument anyway. Other people could clearly address this much better than I could, but I think there are similarities, especially in the early modern period. They're typically erected by groups with power or influence of one form or another. When writing history, they tend to be those who are the winners rather than the losers. To some extent, these groups control history and they present a particular version of it. And that is very similar to antiquity. The one thing I would say today, rather than in the early modern period, is that I think there's much more consciousness and wariness about how incendiary monuments can be. And so when they are put up, it's my sense that there's often a lot more input from a wider range of stakeholders today than there was in antiquity. Whether it's just that those who are putting up monuments pay lip service to this, I think there must be a wide range there. But that is a different goal, to have a lot more involvement today than there was in antiquity.
Yeah, and I mean, what we're seeing now is there's been a lot of unrest in our country and around the world. And vandalism and resistance has been in the news a lot recently. And that's actually something that you've published on that subject as it pertains to ancient Rome. What can you tell us about that?
Well, so my own work was focusing on a series of episodes that are described in literary sources. They date to the late Republic, which was a time of difficulty, of social unrest in general. And at this time, the tribunes of the plebs, those are magistrates, officials who are set up with a job to protect the people from any harm from the other magistrates. So the tribunes of the plebs and members of the broader populace engaged in acts of violence against built structures, whether these were temporary seating, types of temporary seating for games, or voting structures, or temples, or the Senate House. They engaged in acts of violence against them. And these episodes are normally treated separately from each other and as sort of random acts of vandalism. And to my knowledge at the time, nobody had ever thought about them in terms of Roman architecture, thought about them with regard to the buildings which were vandalized. And I think there's a good reason for this, which is suggested by a scholar, Andrew Herscher, who did some work on vandalism, or violence against buildings, I should say, in the Kosovo War. And he recognized that buildings sit obviously in the narrative of architectural history, quite happily to begin with, until they fall victim to destructive acts, at which point we remove them from the discourse on architecture and we put them into the discourse on violence, and different scholars work on them at that point. I mean, you just have to think about how we talk about the World Trade Center towers, for instance. We talk about them as architecture until they become part of the demolition of 9/11, and it's a completely different discourse at that point. So I set out to characterize these late Republican acts of violence against architecture as something more than vandalism, to see if there was something more going on there. I put them in their historical and political contexts, looked at the choice of targets, and I was basically trying to say that they expressed a broad discontent with the political status quo at the time. And in this much, they were clearly ideologically driven. We couldn't just talk about them as random hooliganism. And then once you set them against the patterns of sponsorship, architectural sponsorship that I referred to briefly a few minutes ago, I tried to show that they were part of a calculated strategy to challenge those who were in political authority. So just to make this a little clearer, I suppose, and to refer back to these sponsorship patterns that I was talking about a few minutes ago, because only magistrates can sponsor public architecture, monuments necessarily represent this oligarchy, the Senate. And the system of architectural sponsorship bars everybody outside of the senatorial class. And that means the great majority, even a lot of very rich people, certainly the tribunes of the plebs, who are often very wealthy themselves and who are conditioned to think about architecture as a form of power. All of these people are barred from using this very powerful language of architecture to challenge a system that is very heavily biased against them. And so these late Republican acts of vandalism, I think they challenge that system. They're very deliberately challenging that system. They're serving as a sort of a response to this dominant language of authority expressed and perpetuated through construction. These people recognize that denied access to that language by the constraints of state sponsorship, they can defy it and they can circumvent it and create an architecturally based counter language of their own, which replaces construction by alteration and destruction. So where those in authority, the dominant, build, the dominated who lack that authority, they demolish. And so what I tried to do was to show that even if they're using the same material, these acts should be seen as a means of communication in their own right. And that this is a sort of a form of communication that belongs in a long pattern. I mean, we find this kind of counter language being used in the French Revolution. We find it in the suffragette movement in Britain, Kosovo, 9/11. It's all part of the same way of trying to fight against authority. And I suppose if I were to look at this more broadly, I would say that one of the things that I was trying to achieve in this work was to find another way of hearing the voice of the non-elite. And usually where scholars have looked for the voice of the non-elite, they've looked in non-elite art. And what I was interested in doing was looking for the voice of the non-elite in elite art to see how we could sort of parse it out of there. So that's in a sense what I was trying to do.
It's great, and I'm just gonna. I'm gonna ask you one more question, and we're gonna follow this up with. So I mean, and I think it's very apropos to what you've just discussed. This idea of people taking action, and that this past summer, a University of Alabama archaeologist named Sarah Parcak tweeted instructions on how to safely topple an obelisk or other monument. As an art historian and an archaeologist, what's your take on that?
It's a really good question. Uh, I think I have to start any answer to that question by saying I don't condone violence in any form whatsoever. So put that right there on the table. But I'm also really conscious that the peaceful protest by the disenfranchised often really fails to achieve any meaningful change. And that as a result, that often does turn protesters to violence, to acts of violence. It's very easy to see these as acts of pure hooliganism, and that's how they're often characterized in the press today, to see them as acts of vandalism. But that's all a matter of perception, isn't it? When art historians talk about iconoclasm, they're very careful to note this double standard, that if you're the winner, iconoclasm is a privilege. If you're the loser, you've engaged in sacrilege. So we have to be very conscious of that. So I suppose what I would say is that if peaceful protest fails to achieve change and people turn to ideological violence against monuments as a form of resistance, I can understand, while not condoning, but I can understand an urge to give people instructions on how to do this safely without harming themselves. I suppose that's how I would look at that problem.
Well, I tell you what, I think that's a great perspective on it. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. And, I know that you've got a lot going on, a busy teaching schedule, and clearly a lot of books you're writing. So thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate it.
Michael, it's been a great pleasure, as always. Thank you so much.
All right, and that concludes my interview with Professor Penelope Davies from the University of Texas at Austin. Please stay tuned for further parts of this series as we go forward. Thank you.